Hello, my name is Jean Greco. We're here in Fairfield, Iowa, talking with our guest, Jerry Yellin, who has written a memorable account of his World War II experiences. The book is entitled Of War and Weddings. And I, of course, have read the book and would like to report to you that it is indeed a very moving experience of his experiences. And I would think give the reader a very different feel about war, what war is actually like, so much more than you can garner from movies and television. I would like to read a little from the book jacket to give you, the audience, a feel for what the book is all about. Of War and Weddings is a moving, compelling, and true story of bitter wartime enemies who found peace through their children's marriage. A mysterious force has woven its way into the lives of the Yellin and Yamakawa families that has healed the wounds of war and nurtured a legacy of freedom and understanding for the children of America and Japan. We experience Jerry Yellin's destiny from childhood to retirement. We feel his joys, his loves, his pains. We experience the process of healing as it has had occurred and are moved to discover that the legacy of two fathers is an inheritance intended for us all. Captivating, insightful, and heartwarming from the Nation Independent Review, indeed. So instead of focusing so much on the book, we are going to talk today to you about the experiences that you have had as a result of writing the book.
Okay, Jean, whatever you say.
Okay, because there have been many.
Yes.
And we want to share that with the audience. And you intend to have a lot more because you would like to go out and talk a lot more about the book. Not so much from a marketing perspective, but to share your experiences about war and continue the healing. Could we backtrack before we get into that part a little bit and talk about just one part of the book where you explain what happened to trigger the whole idea of writing the book and to trigger your feelings about war that happened to you so long ago?
I was a very impressionable young man, and when I was 13 in 1937, I saw war for the first time in a newsreel. Japan had invaded China, and the newsreel showed a picture of a 3 or 4-year-old girl, naked, Chinese girl, sitting in front of a burning building. And I've never forgotten that picture. So I had beginnings of a dislike for the Japanese people. That dislike turned to anger as most Americans became angry on December 7th, 1941. Although I had never met a Japanese person, really never saw a Japanese person, I was angry at the entire nation of Japan. And I wanted to do something about it. And I enlisted in the Air Force, Army Air Corps on February 15th, 1942, which was my 18th birthday, just 2 months after Pearl Harbor. My anger and the anger of America towards all of Japan turned to hatred when we started to hear stories about Bataan and Corregidor and the treatment of the American prisoners. I eventually became a fighter pilot, and on March 7th, 1945, flew to Iwo Jima, landed on Iwo Jima. The Marines were still taking the island, still fighting for the island. We taxied to our squadron area, and in going to the squadron area, we passed mounds and mounds and mounds of Japanese bodies waiting for mass burial. And it didn't disturb me one bit. They were not people. They were not human beings. We came close to our squadron area, and we passed the Marine mortuary, and there were hundreds, literally hundreds, of dead American Marines, and that waiting for identification and burial. And that picture has never, ever gone out of my mind. These were Americans and human beings and my fellow citizens, young people, 19, 20 years old. On April 7th, we flew over Tokyo escorting 500 B-29s.
500?
500 B-29s. And I was flying at high cover, about 30,000 feet, and I could see little fires starting to erupt on the ground. Those little fires became bigger fires, and soon square miles of Tokyo were on fire. The city, there were not factories, just the city. And the smoke came up to our altitude, and the debris came up to our altitude. It never occurred to me that there were people on the ground. They weren't human beings, they were Japanese, and it was okay to do that. During the course of the war, I lost a lot of good friends. A lot of people that I had gone through flying school with and became very close to died. Under some circumstances that it could have been me and maybe should have been me. And I carried my hatred of the Japanese all of my adult life. I never thought of Japan as a place to visit. I never thought of the Japanese as people, as human beings, until 1982. I was asked to go to Japan to give a lecture, a series of lectures to Japanese banks about investing in real estate in America. And I was reluctant to go. But Helene had been collecting Japanese artifacts. We bought a screen.
Helene is your wife?
Helene is my wife. And really wanted to go, so I went reluctantly. We landed at Narita Airport on a Saturday night, late, 6:30, 7 o'clock, in the dark, in October of 1982. Took a bus into town, into Tokyo, went into our hotel, checked in, and got up on Sunday morning. And we were staying on the Ginza. The Ginza is a shopping area like Fifth Avenue or like Michigan Avenue in Chicago. Beautiful area. They closed the Ginza to traffic, to cars, and they put out umbrellas, and we went on the Ginza on Sunday morning, and I saw people. I saw children running and playing, and well-dressed people, and the kid waved at us. And for the first time in my life, and I was 59 years old, I realized that Japanese were human beings just like us. And it blew me away. I looked up at the blue sky through the buildings, and I saw myself again in a P-51, and I saw the bombs dropping and the fires erupting. But now I was the recipient. I was on the ground, and I was getting bombed, and it was a devastating experience. We toured Japan. Couldn't stay in Tokyo. Just for my business, I couldn't stay there. We went out into the country, and countryside. We had wonderful people experiences that, and wonderful scenic experiences. The colors were like being in Vermont. The trees were all beautifully, foliage was all in reds and yellows and golds.
And I think you wrote that you were beginning to fall in love with the beauty and grace of this culture.
Yes, I saw a silence that I felt a silence in Japan. Even though it was there was no noise. I never heard a horn blow. I saw orderliness, and I felt a silence even in the cities, even in the small towns that we visited. I felt just like I was in the Rocky Mountains and looking out and felt this enormous silence, this presence. And Helene said to me shortly before we left Japan that our youngest son, Robert, would really like Japan. We had 4 sons, and Robert was the youngest. He was a senior at San Diego State. We came home, and Helene and I offered Robert a graduation present of a trip to Japan. On the day after we spoke about that with him, we saw a little ad in the Los Angeles Times travel section offering a homestay program for $1,600 for 6 weeks in Japan. And we called the YMCA in Los Angeles, made contact. Robert went up and was interviewed because it was really for high school kids, and here was a college senior. And he went and fell in love with Japan. Graduated in 1983 and decided that he would like to spend a year teaching in Japan. And he applied for a job, was accepted. He left in 1984 for 1 year. And it's now 1996 and he hasn't come back yet. In the spring of 1987, Robert asked us to come to Japan as his guest. He wanted me to see the Japan that he knew, not the Japan or the Japanese people that I knew. And we went. He toured us for a number of days around the Izu Peninsula where he lived, in the foothills of Mount Fuji. And on the last night, just before we were ready to come back to America, he said that he wanted to marry a Japanese lady that he had introduced us to Takako Yamakawa. It didn't come as a shock to Helene. She just knew that he was going to get married to a Japanese woman. It came as a shock to me because of my feelings of Japan. There's a culture, there's a race, there's a religion, and there's a war that I had to deal with. And I didn't know if I could deal with it. And my concerns truly were not with me, Gene, but they were with Robert's intended father-in-law, who was a Japanese Air Force veteran, who felt about Americans the same as I felt about the Japanese. And when I discussed this with Robert that night, he said the mother knew and absolutely forbade Takako to marry a gaijin, a foreigner, an American, especially an American, because of the way her father felt. And it took 6 months for her to convince her father to meet my son, to meet Robert. They met in a restaurant, Japanese restaurant, at a ryokan, a Japanese traditional inn. And 2 of Takako's 3 brothers came to that meeting, and they grilled Robert mercilessly. What are you doing in Japan? Why do you want to marry our sister? All you want to do is take her back to America. You want to destroy our family. And the father sat and listened without asking any questions whatsoever. In time, he said to Robert, "How old is your father?" And Robert said, "He's 59 or 61, whatever my age was." "And was he in the war?" Mr. Yamakawa asked. He said, "Yes, he was in the war." "What did he do?" "He was a fighter pilot." "What did he fly?" "P-51s." "Where?" He said he flew over Japan. And Takako started to cry, and Robert said, "It's all over. They'll never get permission." But Mr. Yamakawa said to himself, and he revealed this later, he said to himself, any man who was brave enough to fly a P-51 against the Japanese and lived must be a special person. And he wanted the blood of that man to flow through the veins of his grandchildren, and he okayed the wedding. Didn't tell Robert, but went home and told his wife. Mrs. Yamakawa told Takako, and Takako told Robert. Robert called us and said that the wedding was set for March of 1988.
What were your feelings then? You're talking about the fact that you hadn't quite come to terms. It sounded like you had rectified 3 situations about the Japanese nation, the beauty, the culture, the grace, but then there was the other issue of the war. You haven't told us yet how you were feeling at that point that your son announced his marriage. You were more concerned about your intended in-laws. Where were you?
I think it was a year between the time that I found out about it and the wedding, from March to March of 1987 to March of 1988. And I had a long opportunity to examine myself. I didn't want to stand in the way of my son's marriage. And I did want to embrace and accept his family as my family. So I started to go on an inward journey. And it took me a good 6 or 7 months to accept the fact that the history of war is written by the victor. I looked at the nation, at our country, at the wars with the Indians, at the Revolutionary War. I examined war. I examined everything about war. And I also started to look at myself as a human being, culturally and spiritually, and felt very strongly that all of us were connected as human beings. So I accepted the fact. But until I could sit down face to face with this man and find out what his feelings were, I was not accepting of the marriage, of Robert's marriage to Takako as an American. I'm a patriot. I would do again what I did. I abhor war. I don't think that war is a solution for conflict. I don't think killing is a solution for conflict. But I would do again what I did then under the circumstances. I had to speak to this man, and I wrote him a letter accepting Takako as my daughter into our family. The letter is in the book. And he wrote me something about his feelings, about he's a simple man, and we did the same things in our youth. Had we met when we were 21 years old, we would have killed each other. And he, too, was anxious to meet with me. We went to the wedding. We went to Japan in late February of 1988, a week before the wedding. We had a very cursory meeting with the Yamakawas, a meeting of a traditional exchange of gifts, formalities, all of the formalities. He was a very sensitive person, didn't know if I would eat Japanese food, could sit on the floor, didn't know my physical condition. So we ate at a Chinese restaurant in Japan where you sit down, just the same as a Chinese restaurant here, with a circular table with a go around with the food, and we laughed and talked and exchanged gifts, and it was a nice meeting, but it wasn't satisfactory to me. After the wedding on March 7th at this beautiful 800-year-old shrine in Mishima, it was just a little early for cherry blossoms, but the plum blossoms were out. It was gorgeous scenery again in spring, flowers coming out. At the wedding, there was a banquet after the wedding, and at that banquet I asked Takako, who speaks English very well, if she could arrange for her father and I to spend some time together with an interpreter so we could explore our feelings. And she did. She spoke to her father. We went away 3 days after the wedding on a 3-day trip to Shimoda, which is at the tip of the Izu Peninsula. And he and I, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, went into a hot bath in onsen with an interpreter. And we sat there for 3 hours, talking and laughing and crying. And we explored spirituality, we explored education, we explored family, we spoke about ourselves, we spoke about when we were young, we spoke about what we did, we spoke about how we felt. He had 4 or 5 hours training in a Zero and didn't go any further. They stopped training. He wanted to know what it was like to fly a P-51. All of the Japanese pilots, it seemed, admired the P-51. They thought it was a great airplane, as we did. And after 3 hours of this deep, deep, deep soul searching between the two of us, we walked out. In coming out of the hot bath, he turned to the interpreter and said in Japanese, which of course was translated for me, he said that he never realized that there were other people in the world that felt the same way about what was important in life, about family, about God, about education, about tradition, about culture. He never realized that other people other than the Japanese felt that way. And I felt exactly the same way. I never realized that there were other people that felt the same way as I did, and we bonded and we became very, very close as family, even though we can't speak to each other. Today, we have 2 grandsons and a very newborn baby, which we don't even know the name of. She was born on the 27th of May. And the 2 grandsons, one 6 and one 4, the only difference between their grandparents is that one responds to Grandpa, me, and one responds to Oji-san, Mr. Yamakawa, Taro. But the love that flows back and forth between us is no different than the love that flows back and forth between my other grandchildren and myself, and my sons and daughters and myself, and his family. And we are truly a family. And that really prompted me to come back and to put my thoughts down on paper. So I started to write. We were the only members of our family, other than Robert, who were at the wedding. And I wanted my sons to know, in all of the years that I had raised a family, no one ever heard me speak about the war. I never, ever mentioned anything in particular about what I did, except that I flew an airplane over Japan, that I hated the Japanese, that I bailed out and spent 9 hours in the ocean at one point, and that's all they ever knew. And I felt now I had to tell my story because there was such a change in the attitude. I started to write. A friend of Robert's was an editor and a reporter for a local newspaper in San Diego. He edited what I had written, and it became a story of war and weddings in the San Diego magazine in December of 1988. And people asked me to expand it into a book, and I did. The manuscript was submitted, like all new manuscripts, especially by non-writers. It was rejected 75 or 80 times by
Is that
agents.
right?
Yeah.
But you were motivated to continue?
No, I put it away, actually. I just put it in the closet. And when I came to Fairfield in 1990, I spoke a little bit about trying to get it published, and Fairfield Printing picked it up, liked it, published it. And a year ago, April, we went on a national book signing tour, which was an absolute revelation for me. I don't know how any book gets published or gets sold. You go into a bookstore, there's 500,000 titles. We were on the tour at the time of the Simpson trial, and the Simpson books were coming out, and then Colin Powell wrote a book, and all of these people get tremendous press, and we had good press wherever we were because everyone liked the story. It's a healing story. But the book became unimportant. The people that I met, and the experiences that I had, led me into feeling like a missionary. I had to tell this story, especially to young people.
And you're still feeling that way today?
Even more.
We're talking a year later now, after the book tour.
Right.
And it seems as if you have really shifted your emphasis from trying to reach adults with this story to reaching out to young people about the story. Do you?
I speak to adults. I speak to Kiwanis. I speak to Rotary. I'm going to speak at a church here sometime in June. I speak to adults to help them face what they feel. People of my generation in America still have deep feelings about Japan and the Japanese. And I would too, had I not gone through this experience. I often wonder what my mother would have thought had I been killed and my sister came home with a Japanese man as a husband. And that's what goes on. So I do speak to children. But last August I was in Oshkosh at the air show, had the book there. And a young boy heard me speaking, standing in front of a P-51. And he came up to me and asked me questions. His father said, "Don't go to him. He doesn't own that airplane. He's an old man." You know. But I spoke to this young boy. Bobby Rubens is his name. He's from Lockport, Illinois. And I told him that I was on a book tour and I would be near Chicago, in Chicago, on a specific date. And he and his father came to the book signing. He wanted an autographed copy of the book, this 11-year-old boy. And I said, "Bobby, if you will introduce me in your school, I'll come and speak to your school." And his father, who was a commercial pilot, said, "I'll fly to Iowa and pick you up." So I had that experience of speaking to fourth and fifth graders and high school students in Lockport, Illinois.
And that was your first experience in speaking?
This was my first experience speaking on that level. The interest and the questions that they asked will never go out of my mind. To fourth and fifth graders, I don't speak about the war as much as I speak about differences in culture, differences about people, how they think and what they are. And one boy in the fifth grader asked me, "Was I hurt? Were you hurt?" That's a pretty profound question, was I hurt? And I said, "Not in a way that you would know. I didn't bleed, I didn't have a broken leg, I wasn't physically hurt, but I was hurt in my heart and in my mind all of my life until I started to speak." The teachers were sitting in the back, they all started to cry. And these kinds of profound experiences have connected me to everyone. It's led me to really examine what a human being is. A human being, regardless of race, regardless of color. And all of us are made up exactly the same way. We all have cells within us. And each cell has the knowledge of the universe that comes with the body. It's not something we train. We don't train the blood cells to be blood cells and to do that, or the kidney cells, or the heart cells. We are all made up of the same way. And that these cells in our body each know what to do. And when one cell goes bad, one cell goes awry, one cell becomes cancerous, every other cell in the body suffers. Every cell. And eventually we die. And I liken we human beings as being cells of the universe. And that we all have a mission, we all have a job, we're all different, but we're all human. And if I needed blood in Japan, if I had to have a blood transfusion in Japan, the blood of a Japanese man wouldn't have to learn English, wouldn't have to learn anything about me. The knowledge of the universe, the divine, is in that blood cell, the same as in mine. And that links me all together. So that's a message that I want to get out to the children. And I've been in the Fairfield schools a number of times, the high schools, and the 7th and 8th grade. And I've been to Lockport, I've been to Kentucky. I've been on the internet speaking to 500 children from around the world on a chat group. I don't type so fast, and it's not live as far as being visible, but it's live with the questions. And all of us, all of the young people ask the same questions.
I think, excuse me, they have given you, I think, a lot that you didn't count on. They're pure, genuine reactions. And I have some sample letters here of what students have written to you. And again, they communicate that maybe they had a relative, a grandfather, a great uncle who was in the war and will not speak about it. And these children seem to be yearning for stories just like yours so they can truly understand the war. They're saying, I'm not getting it from the media. I'm not understanding what war is all about. So it sounds like a two-way gift process that's going on here. What the children give back to you keeps you going in communicating the message.
I can only give them of me. And if I'm speaking with 40 other people, I get feedback from 40 people. They're only getting feedback from one. And I speak on the level of these are my friends. I'm not lecturing. I'm sharing my life. I'm not an expert on war. I'm not an expert on humanity. I'm an expert on me. I know what I am, everything that I am, and I'm willing to share all of this so that no one else has to go through what I went through. There isn't anyone who served in a war in any country that hasn't been scarred and will be scarred for life. And my biggest nightmare is, with 2 grandsons in Japan and grandson and 2 granddaughters in America, that if we ever went to war, that they would be fighting against each other. If we ever went to war again, and whose side would I take? And I want that message to go to the children. So it's been an incredible experience with the young people. I've learned much more than I can ever teach. They're aware.
A high school student from Fairfield, whose name is Shayna, writes, I thought Mr. Yellin was amazing. As I watched this man, I saw the movies, heard the noises, the planes, the bombs, the cries. As he talked, I looked into his eyes because your eyes never change. One may get bald or gray and wrinkly, but your eyes remain constant, and I saw him young and fierce. He was so appealing to the senses through his words, at times I was wondering whether this was a speaker on war or a motivational speaker for humanity. It was obvious to me he's overcome so much hatred and fury to reach the point to where he does have the right to stand up and tell his story, and even sell the story. He and all others like him deserve so much credit for their heroism. His presence was refreshing. It's only too bad that most others like him still hold hostility.
Yes, when I cry when I read some of these letters. They come from the heart. They're pure. There's no hidden agenda. And that's the beauty of it. I'm so proud of our school system here in Fairfield and what they stand for. And I said this to John Kelly, the superintendent of schools. He says, well, I'll give all credit to the teachers. And it's wonderful to be able to go in and just have that freedom of connection. And connection is what life is about. Someone once wrote that unity will occur when competition changes to connection. And it's the competition, the fierceness of pride and that creates wars. So we have to become connected.
Another letter, I believe, from a middle school student. It took you a whole lifetime to figure out that everyone is alike and we are all human beings. You taught me this in all of 10 minutes, and if you hadn't been here, in effect, it would also might have taken me a whole lifetime to come to this realization.
Isn't that amazing that this an 8th grader, 13 or 14 years old, has enough insight to look into himself and say, well, I don't have to go through that now. I just know that because I looked at this man and he was believable.
Who's experienced something that I can relate to.
Yes.
Another student writes, I still have images in my head of Japanese soldiers laying dead in huge masses at Iwo Jima. I still can't imagine how it would be seeing people die and get blown up today.
I spoke at one time to try to give this particular class an insight as to what a war zone looks like, a battle zone, especially an island like Iwo Jima, where 8 square miles of land, 28,000 people were killed for 8 square miles of land. I flew over that land 10 years ago, and I was on the eastern side of the island at 30,000 feet looking west, and I put my hand up to shade my eyes, and the tip of my thumb blocked out that island. There was 28,000 people killed. That's how big it was. And I talked about roadkill, riding along the road, and you see a raccoon or a rabbit or a bird or a deer. Picture hundreds, thousands of them as you ride along the road, and that's what a war zone looks like. And it made a big impression on them. So
yes, I see that in several letters. It did make quite an impression, that scene that you painted, and you're really quite forthright and painful in your descriptions. I mean, I imagine that this stirs up a lot of pain for a lot of people besides American vets. When it's being read on Japanese soil, I would imagine that the stirrings are just tremendous among people.
I have a number of letters from Japanese adults who have read the book. As a matter of fact, the university where my son teaches English one day a week is using the book as a reader for the English class. Seniors in college reading this book as an English reader. And I will be speaking to them in October, physically being in Japan.
Oh, to that class?
To that class.
Okay.
And to other classes in Japan.
And you will also be going in October to Hiroshima?
Yes, I was looking for P-51, pictures of P-51s and stories about P-51s on the internet 6 or 7 months ago, and a link was given to me to the A-bomb museum in Hiroshima. So I transferred over to the A-bomb museum, visited the exhibit on the internet, and there was a place for comments, and I was just moved to make a comment and gave them a link there to my book, which is on, I have a homepage with my book on it. And I received a letter from the director of the A-bomb museum, Mr. Oba, who said that his father was a Zero pilot in World War II, never spoke about the war, but told him that the only airplane that he ever feared was a P-51. And that was his comment back to me. We started a dialogue, and he invited me to speak at the A-bomb museum in October, and he also suggested to the elementary schools that I go there, and he's arranged for a 1-week speaking tour to the schools in Hiroshima, in the elementary schools in Japan.
Okay, just backtrack a little bit for me. What exactly was the job of a P-51?
Well, the P-51 is a fighter plane, and what a fighter plane is a gun platform that can go anywhere. It's very mobile. We carried 8 50 caliber machine guns, and we could carry rockets, and sometimes on short-range missions we could carry a 500-pound bomb. The true mission that we started out with was to fend off the Japanese fighter planes who were attacking the B-29s. The B-29s flew 12 hours up and back from Saipan, Guam, and Tinian to drop their bombs on Japan. And they had no fighter escort. All they had when they were in formation were their turret guns and their nose gun and their tail gun. And that's not enough because you're in formation, and the Japanese fighters would come in and destroyed a lot of B-29s, 12 to 14 American servicemen in each one of those airplanes. And when they went down, That's what happened.
Okay.
So the job
So
of the fighter
you were-
plane was to be an escort. That's what they took Iwo Jima for, was to be, so that the fighters could have the range to fly over Japan and escort the B-29s. In June of 1945, they stopped sending up fighters, the Japanese. They took everything, all their gasoline, which was minimal, and all of their supplies, and they were trying to figure out where we were going to invade. They knew an invasion was coming. So they stopped sending up airplanes. Then our mission became to find as many airplanes on the ground, or train stations, or boats, or anything, and go down and strafe them and shoot rockets at them. And the pure purpose of war is to kill as many of your enemy as you can, so that they don't want to continue to fight. And that's what we were trying to do, kill the enemy.
When you go to Hiroshima in October, do you anticipate softening your presentation, softening your story, softening your experiences?
No, I'm not anticipating making any changes in who I am, and what I did. I'm not going to change anything. They're going to know my feelings, because my feelings went 180 degrees, from hatred to love of humanity, to connection, to a much more profound and deep connection to the divine. I don't want to put a name on the divine, but to the universe, to natural law, to nature, a much greater connection to that, which connects me to all human beings, regardless of who they are. And it's my story, that what happened to me, I don't have to fictionalize, I don't have to make anything up. All I have to do is share with them. Mm-hmm. And I think that I think that they'll have to make up their mind about that. I received a note by the email from a 35-year-old fifth grade teacher, and mm-hmm. I think you might have that, that note. And it's just an incredible thing that they want to know too. The Japanese don't talk about war the same way that we do. They absolutely don't. The history of war is written by the victor, and not, it's government writing, it's government talking about it, but war is about people, young people. What disturbed me most about my trip to Japan in 1982 was the fact that all of my leaders, all of my elected officials, all of the people who were ahead of our government had fought in World War I. And all of the people that the leaders of the countries that we fought against, had fought as soldiers in World War I. And yet we continued to commit, to do all of the things that lead to conflict, that lead to war. And that disturbed me more than anything else.
But you've admitted that this was a different type of aggression.
Evil is evil, and it was a war of evil. It was a war started by evil people. Evil has to be wiped out. And that's another story entirely. But yes, I was on the right side. We were protected. When you really examine it, the last bastion of freedom was England. Europe was gone to Germany. And America at the time, and this is political, I'm not a politician, just studying of this, was a America First Nation. We would never send anybody else. So we didn't get into the war for pure reasons. We didn't go help England, say, let's go over there. Mm-hmm. There were numbers of people who went, the Flying Tigers went to China to fight the Japanese, and there were some volunteers went to Canada to join the Canadian Air Force and Canadian forces. But we didn't get in as a nation for pure reasons. We got in because we were attacked. So had Japan not attacked America, we probably wouldn't have gotten into the war. History would have been different.
So you're talking about, they don't talk about war in Japan as we talk about war here.
No.
The history books are written by the victors,
right.
The perceived victors.
Right.
But yet in this, I believe you said fifth grade teacher's discussion with his students, a student is prompted to ask, is this Jerry Yellin a nice man?
Well, why don't you read it? I think it's an incredible insight.
Well, the teacher writes to you via the internet, thank you for your friendly message. First, I read your homepage. You give me a great chance for me to consider about peace and war deeply. I told my students about you. The first question is Jerry really a good person? So clearly these students understand the source of their problem in Hiroshima. The reason why the children asked that question is the U.S. dropped bombs onto Japan. I asked the children, do you really think that Jerry is wrong? We discussed this for an hour. As a result, we know that it is not Jerry, but a war, which is truly wrong. Now that the children understand you and are looking forward, they are looking forward to hearing from you. If I tell you the thing that makes you upset, please forgive me. We also hope to keep in touch with you.
Right. When I say, if we asked an American Indian about the war that took their land in the West, would they tell the same story as the story that we read and we understand? It's only now that we understand a little bit about what happened in America because it's coming out more. And the Japanese, well, when I go to Japan, there doesn't seem to be any resentment about young people, but the older people, every once in a while, I feel that they're looking at me a little bit differently. Maybe their husbands were killed or their brothers were killed in the war. And they look about it a little different. The younger people, even in this country, don't read all of what transpired to make the war happen.
Right.
Gene, I really don't want to get into the reasons for war and all of that, but Japan went to war for oil. America threatened to embargo oil if Japan didn't get out of China. We took the side of China because Japan had invaded them. And we said to them, well, we're going to embargo the oil. We're not going to sell you any more oil. We're going to embargo. We're going to take all of our ships and we're going to stop any ship from coming in that's bringing you oil. We weren't at war. We were negotiating, and then Pearl Harbor happened. So they went to war for oil. In 1992 or 93, Kuwait was invaded by Iraq, and we took the side of Kuwait because we wanted to protect our war, our oil supply. So we went and did exactly the same thing in Iraq that the Japanese did with us to protect our oil. No different. We study what we did as being a righteous thing. We went out and killed 100,000 people. We protected our oil. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, killed 2,800 people trying to protect their oil. Tell me what the difference is. I can't figure it out. That's not what I talk about. But there's an underlying message that every country writes their own history. Every race writes their own history. Every religion writes their own history. And that separates us. What I'm trying to do in my own way to leave this world just a little bit better is to try and connect people by sharing my life and my experiences with anyone who will listen. Hopefully we'll have a big audience here.
And so do you anticipate, do you think these students in Hiroshima have heard from your Japanese counterparts?
I don't think so.
Is there anyone with that kind of message being carried out there?
I don't really believe that there is. I think the government in Japan completely controls the history that is taught. And I don't think that there is anyone speaking on the level of human beings, not governments. We can all read about governments. Few of us read about human beings, the human story, one soldier to another story. I never believed the Japanese, as people, felt about life as I did, or felt about culture as I did, felt about education as I did, felt about family as I did. I just thought they were a bunch of animals. And taunting and brutal and cruel. That's what I was taught. The Japanese of the time were taught the same thing about America. I received a letter from one of the students here whose grandfather told him that the Japanese were so cruel that they would use the arm bones of American dead to make letter openers and things like that. And he believed it, and he told it to his grandson. Well, that's not so. That's propaganda. That's government propaganda. And I want to dispel that if I can. Wars are two people fighting against each other for their own survival. because their government said, this is what we want to do. Right. And it's a people thing. It's a people-to-people thing. We in the Civil War had brothers fighting against brothers for ideological reasons, and ideology sometimes gets in the way. We as a country started America in a revolution because we felt, the Americans of the time felt, that they were oppressed by somebody. So they started a war. It's the only way that you can take. There was no dialogue. And we wrote the history of America. The British, had they won, every one of our forefathers, the Washingtons, the Jeffersons, all of the Adams family, they would have been the war traitor. They would have had a trial just like Nuremberg had the British won. And then the history of America would have been entirely different. Mm-hmm. And we have to look at it from the human side. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm trying to do.
So you said earlier you're a patriot.
Yes.
And if you had it to do over, you would do it again.
Yes, I would do it again.
Yeah, I understood you correctly.
Yes, I would do it again, not knowing what I know today, but under the conditions that existed at the time. Knowing what I know.
You would have made the same decisions.
I would have made the same decisions then, but I couldn't make the same decisions now because I've had these experiences.
Right. You're looking at us as a global humanity, no longer seeing borders and reasons.
I see no borders. I see the universe, and I see nature. I see all of us as within our body, we're a universe. We have a heart, we have kidneys, all of the organs. That's our universe, each a different country within our body, and they function harmoniously within our body. And I see that as a universe, each country. There's a divine plan. If there is a divine plan, we don't know what that plan is. All we know is that if we are the best that we can possibly be, then the universe functions. Mm-hmm. And any one country or any one person within a country that violates the laws of nature makes it bad for everybody. That's the cancer. That's the disease.
So when we first met, the book had just come out. You were very excited about it. You're talking about it a year ago with the same enthusiasm and vigor that you are now. What's going to happen next? I see deep within you. There's this yearn and yin to get this message out. What's going to happen next with the book, and with Jerry Yellin? What's going to happen next?
Well, I can't predict anything for the book. It was not a big run. I think that it may have run its course. It may not have run its course. The book has only been a tool for me. A tool for me to look at myself, to examine myself, and to say, yes, I don't want to talk about books and selling books. I want to talk about my experiences so that perhaps the young people of today won't have to go to war, won't have to go into the military. There's a tremendous amount of talk today of the biological warfare, the germ warfare, the better tools of killing people that are out there. And I would like to see those better tools of progress of science eliminated. I often wonder, would Fermi have split the atom had he known the way it was going to be used? I often wonder if the Wright brothers would have invented the airplane had they known the way it was going to be used. So there's a lot of knowledge that has to be given of human beings one to another. And I have a very small part in that. And that's what's in store for Jerry Yellin. I want to spend the rest of my life getting these letters back from 8th graders and from seniors in high school and juniors in high school and 5th graders in schools around the country, that I made them take a look at themselves and in their relationship with themselves and their relationships with their country and their relationships with the world. And there's a wonderful story about a young man who graduated from a theological seminary and took upon himself, he had all this great knowledge, he was 30 years old, he was going to change the world, and he started out on that big project, and in time he said, gee, the world's a big place, I can't change that, maybe if I just change my country, and he couldn't do that, and then he said, if I can only change my city, maybe it'll make an impact. He couldn't do that. He said, just my town, just the neighborhood that I live in, and he couldn't do that. And he said, if I can only change my family, I'll make an impact. And finally, he came to the realization, almost when he was dying, that if he was just changed himself to become what he wanted everyone else to do, he would have influenced his family, who would have influenced the neighborhood, who would have influenced the city, the state, the country, the world. So I'm trying to tell people that what you are is the same as what everybody else is. Take a look at yourself. Religion is yours privately, but that's not what you are. What you are is internal, within you. And that's the message that I'm trying to give out.
And this is where the message is written. It is a story of change and intense transformation. The man of the hour is Jerry Yellin, the author of the book of War and Weddings. I think you can contact him to get copies of the book. As you heard, he plans to continue taking his message about war and transformation to you, students of all ages. And with that, we will close from Fairfield, Iowa. Thanks for watching.